The sound that wasn't there said everything. A Montana courtroom full to the brim with neighbors, journalists, and strangers somehow felt emptied of air. Daniel Whitaker stood in his hunting boots, his wrists cuffed before him, his broad shoulders bowed in defeat. For most of his 51 years, Daniel had been known as a man of the land. A steady hand who guided hunters through the grizzly bear country around Flathead National Forest. A man who could track elk across ridge lines and recognize the call of a black bear mother echoing through the timber. But here, under the sterile fluorescent lights, those qualities meant nothing. The only thing people saw was a killer. The judge adjusted her glasses. Her voice carried no malice, only the kind of weight that comes when law feels heavier than truth. Daniel Whitaker. This court sentences you to death by lethal injection. Upon completion of extradition proceedings, you will be remanded to Mexican custody for execution. The words struck like a rifle shot. In the gallery, someone gasped. Others muttered. A journalist scribbled pen-scratching paper like claws against bark. Why Mexico? That was the question, echoing in whispers. The answer lay in treaties and politics. The man Daniel was accused of murdering an environmental activist named Javier Cruz had been a dual U.S.-Mexican citizen. Under the USS. Mexico. Extradition treaty cases involving Mexican citizens could be transferred south of the border. Mexico rarely asked, but when it did, it was often for cases with symbolic value. Javier's death had stirred outrage across both countries. Images of him holding up signs reading "Protect the Grizzly Bear" had circled the internet. His supporters wanted justice that felt permanent, irreversible. Mexico still carried capital punishment statutes for certain forms of obstruction and murder. So Daniel's fate was sealed not in Helena, not in Washington, but by a handshake agreement between two governments. Daniel said nothing. He had spoken once long before the trial to claim his innocence. But every word after that seemed to twist back on him. So when the verdict came, he held his silence like a shield. His lawyer, a tired public defender with paper spilling out of his briefcase, lowered his head in resignation. Daniel's daughter, Emily, wasn't in the room. At 8 years old, she had been kept away from the cameras and the rage. Instead, she was somewhere safe, or as safe as a child could be, while her father faced death for something he swore he hadn't done. That courtroom silence had another layer of disbelief, because for years Daniel had been more than just a hunter. He had been a protector of the land. He volunteered with wildlife rescue teams, once carrying a wounded grizzly cub on his shoulders for 3 miles down a ravine to reach a ranger station. Locals remembered the photo, Daniel's weathered face set in determination, the cub clinging to him, its tiny claws digging into his jacket. That image had made the rounds in wildlife photography magazines, even featured in a bear documentary. To his neighbors, Daniel had been proof that hunters and conservationists didn't have to stand on opposite sides. And yet here he was convicted of killing a man whose mission was to defend those same animals. The contradiction was too sharp, too bitter. Some people in the room shook their heads. Others avoided looking at him at all. There's something about silence in a courtroom that feels heavier than shouting. When voices rise, you can push back. But silence is a vacuum. It tells you people have already decided. For Daniel, that silence pressed down on him harder than the cuffs on his wrists. Outside the courthouse, the noise was anything but quiet. Protesters carried signs, "Justice for Javier." "Protect endangered animals." "Hunters are killers." Some chanted, some cried, some simply stared at the courthouse doors waiting for Daniel to emerge. The press cameras waited too. They wanted the shot of the condemned man, the hunter whose rifle had spilled human blood. How quickly public opinion can shift. A man can spend decades building trust, living by principle, raising his child, and protecting wildlife. And in a matter of days, one news cycle, one headline, he can be painted as a monster. It's not unique to Daniel's story. It's something we've seen in history again and again. A decorated soldier accused of treason. A beloved coach was condemned in a scandal. A respected officer was painted as corrupt. The pattern is the same. Evidence appears, the story spreads, and silence becomes judgment before the trial even ends. It's easy to forget in those moments that truth takes time. Lies travel fast, but truth requires patience, persistence, and proof. That's a small lesson tucked into Daniel's story. When you hear a single version of events, especially the kind that inflames anger, it's worth pausing to ask, who benefits from this story? What's missing from the picture? In Daniel's case, what was missing was his voice. He never had a chance to truly defend himself. The state's evidence was a rifle registered to him, fingerprints on the stock, and testimony that he had been seen arguing with Javier days before the murder. On paper, it was convincing. But in Daniel's eyes, you could see a man bewildered by how neatly he had been cornered. When the judge finished, bailiffs moved to escort him out. Daniel lifted his head once, scanning the faces in the gallery. Some turned away. Others stared back cold and certain. He did not search for pity. What he searched for was recognition that someone in the crowd might see him not as a criminal, but as the man they had once trusted to lead them safely through bear country, the man who had shown children how to identify tracks along the riverbed. No recognition came. Then something unusual stirred in the back. It wasn't a loud interruption, not yet. It was more of a ripple, like wind moving through tall grass. A boy near the aisle pointed. Another spectator shifted uncomfortably. Even the bailiffs paused. It was the kind of moment that doesn't belong in courtrooms, the kind that carries mystery. But for now, the story held still. Daniel walked out, flanked by guards, chains clinking at his wrists, a condemned man waiting for a date to be set in a country he barely knew. The silence followed him, heavy and unrelenting. That was the official ending of the first chapter. But unofficially, the story was just beginning. Because outside that courtroom, beyond the reporters, beyond the shouting protesters, there was a trail of clues that hadn't been followed. A weapon too conveniently placed. A fingerprint too clear. And somewhere in the forests, Daniel loved a grizzly bear cub named Copper still lived, carrying with him a piece of truth no one had thought to look for. When we think about justice, we often imagine it as clean and decisive, guilty, or innocent, right or wrong. But reality is messier. It's filled with gaps, contradictions, and silences that swallow truth whole. Daniel's story reminds us that silence in court is not the same as silence in reality. Out there in the wild places where humans rarely tread, there were voices still unheard, voices that would change everything. As Daniel was led away to a cell where he would spend nights wrestling with despair, the seeds of his redemption were already taking root. They would come from unexpected allies, from hidden recordings, and most astonishingly, from a creature too young to understand human politics, but old enough to carry memory in its eyes. And that's where the story turns away from the sterile courtroom and toward the rugged landscapes of Montana, where Daniel's past and future were both waiting. Before Daniel Whitaker was a condemned man in chains, he was a boy who learned to read the woods the way others read books. His father, a quiet ranch hand, used to take him into the back country of Montana with little more than a pack, a rifle, and an old pair of binoculars. They weren't there for trophies. They were there for survival meat in the freezer pelts, for winter proof that a family could live close to the land without ever setting foot into a grocery store. Daniel grew up where grizzly bear tracks were part of the daily language, and the whistle of an elk bugle meant autumn had truly arrived. By the time he was 15, he could spot fresh claw marks on a lodgepole pine and tell whether it belonged to a black bear or a grizzly. He could distinguish the scent of wet earth mixed with musk that meant a bear cub was nearby. To Daniel, these details weren't just trivia. They were signals, warnings, and invitations all at once. It made him the kind of hunter others trusted, the one who never wasted a shot, never left a wounded animal to suffer, and always respected the boundaries of the forest. Years later, after serving in the Marines overseas, Daniel came home with scars that didn't always show. Like many veterans, he found himself restless, sometimes haunted, unsure where he fit. But the land called him back. Flathead National Forest glaciers, rugged ridges, the rivers that cut through pine valleys, they gave him a kind of therapy. No hospital could. Out there, with the crunch of snow under his boots and the sight of a bald eagle sweeping across the sky, he felt anchored again. That's where Copper entered his life. It was late spring, the rivers swollen with meltwater. Daniel had been guiding a group of out-of-state hunters when they stumbled upon a young grizzly cub tangled in an old wire fence near a trail. The hunters wanted to keep moving, they hadn't paid for detours. But Daniel knelt knife in hand and spent nearly an hour cutting through the rusted wire, ignoring the cub's frantic squeals. He knew the mother might be near, knew he could be mauled if she appeared. But he also knew what pain looked like, and he couldn't walk away. The cub's paw bled its fur, patchy with stress. Daniel wrapped it in his own flannel, carried the trembling bundle down to the ranger station, and stayed until a wildlife rescue team arrived. Someone snapped a photo. Daniel, mud on his face, exhaustion in his eyes, with the cub slung across his shoulders. That photo went further than he imagined. It was shared in wildlife magazines, posted on animal rescue blogs, and even used in a short grizzly bear documentary about human-animal coexistence. People called him a hero. Daniel just said I couldn't let him suffer. The cub survived. Rangers named him Copper for the reddish sheen in his fur. He became part of a nearby animal sanctuary, a place where injured or orphaned forest animals could heal. Daniel visited often, sometimes bringing Emily with him. For an 8-year-old girl fighting a rare autoimmune illness, the sanctuary was her wonderland. She'd laugh when Copper tried to paw at her shoes, through the fence giggle when he rolled onto his back like a puppy demanding attention. "He knows you saved him, Dad," she'd say with absolute certainty. And maybe she was right. The bond between Daniel and that bear cub became a symbol, even if neither of them could have explained it. It wasn't ownership. It wasn't even friendship in the way people usually define it. It was more like recognition, two survivors who understood each other's fragility. Emily clung to that bond even when the rest of the world turned against her father. When reporters called him a murderer, when classmates whispered that her dad killed a man, Emily would insist Copper knows the truth. If Dad was bad, Copper wouldn't love him. For a child, loyalty is that simple. And sometimes that's what adults forget, that children see through actions more than words. There's a small lesson in that. When the world piles accusations on someone, children often cut to the heart of the matter. They don't need legal jargon or courtroom speeches. They ask, who shows up? Who protects? Who comforts? For Emily, the sight of her dad carrying that bear cub years before was evidence enough. Daniel's connection to wildlife went beyond Copper. He often volunteered in animal rescue operations, once helping tranquilize a black bear that had wandered into a school playground, another time leading a search for missing hikers by following wolf tracks to where their camp had collapsed. He wasn't perfect. He was a hunter after all, and he believed deeply in hunting as a way of life. But he carried an ethic that many outsiders failed to understand. Respect the animals. Honor the land, take only what you need. That ethic is something many hunters across North America live by, though it rarely makes headlines. News stories love the image of poachers and piles of antlers. They rarely linger on the hunter who donates elk meat to food banks, or the tracker who spends hours ensuring no animal suffers unnecessarily. Daniel represented that quieter truth, and yet it was this very background that made his conviction sting more. To those who once admired him, the accusation of murder didn't just say that Daniel had killed a man. It said he had betrayed everything he stood for. It was as if the photo of him saving Copper had been ripped up in front of the world. Sometimes the most damning accusations target not what a person has done, but what they symbolize. Daniel symbolized the bridge between hunters and conservationists, between rugged tradition and modern environmentalism. Taking him down, whether by design or coincidence, struck at that bridge itself. It divided a community that had long tried to reconcile those worlds. We can look to history for comparisons. When officers exposed corruption inside their own departments, they were often branded as traitors. When whistleblowers revealed truths about industries, they were painted as unstable. Daniel's case followed the same playbook frame, the one who challenges the system. Discredit the symbol. Silence the bridge. Emily didn't see all that, of course. She only saw her dad's absence, the loneliness of visiting him behind glass. She pressed her small hands against the barrier, telling him Copper still remembers. He's waiting for you. That was how children make sense of betrayal, through stories, through faith, that the bonds they've seen with their own eyes cannot be false. If there's a broader takeaway here, it's this. People underestimate the power of memory. Not just human memory, but the memory carried in actions, in bonds, even in animals. Copper's story was far from over. Though he was just a cub, saved from a wire, his very existence would later cut through lies stronger than court evidence. But at this stage, he remained a silent witness, his future tied unknowingly to Daniel's. The hunters Daniel once guided remembered him for his patience. The rangers remembered him for his steady hands. Emily remembered him for being the man who couldn't ignore a suffering cub. Yet in court, none of those memories mattered. What mattered was the planted rifle, the staged argument, the fingerprints too clear to be real. How could a man defined by bonds with wild animals suddenly be recast as a killer of men and protector of poachers? It didn't add up. Some neighbors whispered doubts. Others turned away, unwilling to question the official line. The press preferred the sharper story, hunter turns murderer. Complexity rarely sells, but the truth has its own pace. It lingers in memories, in hidden records, in the loyalty of children and animals alike. And in Daniel's case, it lingered in the quiet presence of Copper, waiting for the right moment to resurface. Daniel himself, sitting in a prison cell, would think back to those days in the forest with Emily and the cub. He'd close his eyes and hear the sound of Copper's playful growl, feel the weight of the cub's claws digging through his flannel as he carried him to safety. Those memories weren't just comfort. They were anchor points, reminders of who he truly was when the world insisted otherwise. The bond between a hunter and a bear cub might sound like a contradiction, but it carried a mystery worth noticing, that sometimes the most unlikely relationships hold the most truth. And it was this bond, fragile and improbable, that would eventually unravel the conspiracy against him. For now, though, that bond remained hidden, a flicker of light in a storm that was only growing darker. And the storm had a name: betrayal. The betrayal of a man Daniel trusted most. Trust doesn't usually shatter in one moment. More often it erodes quietly, like a trail losing shape under endless rain, until one day you realize the ground beneath you is gone. For Daniel Whitaker, that ground had always been steady because of one man, Michael Hayes. Michael wasn't just a colleague. He was the kind of partner people prayed for in dangerous work. They had spent 2 decades together as wardens and enforcement officers, sharing blizzards in the high country and heat stroke in the valleys. When Daniel's wife passed, it was Michael who made sure Emily got to school on mornings. Daniel could barely lift himself out of bed. When Copper was first brought to the sanctuary, it was Michael who drove through the night to help deliver fencing. People around town joked that they were like 2 sides of the same coin: Daniel, the quiet compass; Michael, the outspoken strategist. That's what made the betrayal cut so deep. It began with the missing firearms. Confiscated weapons from illegal hunters, seized rifles from border traffickers, items logged into evidence that somehow vanished months later. Daniel started noticing patterns: a grizzly bear documentary crew reporting gang shootings in towns miles away, the recovered bullets matching calibers stored in their own evidence lockers. The connection gnawed at him. When he brought it up to Michael one late autumn evening, Michael's reaction startled him. The older man's silver hair caught the lantern light as he snapped, "Some stones are better left unturned." His voice carried an edge Daniel had never heard before, sharp and final. That was the first red flag, but Daniel brushed it off. Maybe Michael was just tired. But the warnings didn't stop. Every time Daniel pulled a thread tracking serial numbers, cross-checking ballistics, Michael would appear, urging him to back down. "Don't drag yourself into this mess," he said once, almost pleading. "Think about Emily. You don't want her to grow up without a father." At the time, it sounded like concern. In hindsight, it was a warning. The murder of Javier Cruz brought everything into focus. Javier had been an activist who walked a dangerous line. He criticized hunters openly, accusing them of fueling poaching rings, but he also met with Daniel privately to discuss how hunting regulations could actually protect endangered animals. They argued often, sometimes heatedly. But beneath the surface, Javier trusted Daniel enough to share tips about illegal shipments of firearms moving through forest roads. Javier was reckless, but he wanted justice. When Javier was found dead, shot clean through the chest with Daniel's registered rifle, the story wrote itself. Prosecutors painted Daniel as the hunter who snapped tired of being harassed by an activist. Witnesses testified they saw the two men arguing days earlier. The rifle was discovered at the scene, his fingerprints clear as day. And the first officer on site, Michael Hayes. Daniel's world flipped. He replayed every memory, every late-night campfire conversation, every moment of shared hardship. Could it all have been a lie? The simplest explanation was the hardest to swallow. Michael had planted the evidence. Here's where perspective matters. Betrayal. In the wilderness carries a different weight than betrayal in an office. Out there, survival depends on the man at your side. You trust him to cover you when a grizzly charges to share water, when supplies run low to stand guard, when night falls and coyotes circle. When that trust is broken, it doesn't just shake confidence, it unravels your sense of reality. Take, for example, the story of a search and rescue team in Colorado years ago. A ranger confided in his partner about suspicions of smuggling activity. Days later, that ranger fell during a climb, his harness mysteriously cut. Officially, it was ruled an accident. Unofficially, whispers of betrayal still echo. When trust erodes in wild places, proof rarely follows, but the pattern is there haunting. For Daniel, the betrayal carried more than personal pain. It meant the system he served was compromised. If Michael could orchestrate such a frame-up, who else was involved? The idea that corruption reached into their department, the very office sworn to protect both wildlife and people, tore at him. Betrayal rarely arrives from enemies. It comes from those close enough to know your weaknesses, your routines, your blind spots. Daniel never suspected Michael because Michael was family in every sense but blood. And that blind faith created the perfect opening for manipulation. Why did Michael do it? Greed was part of the story. Later, evidence revealed offshore accounts, untraceable transfers, and luxury purchases inconsistent with a warden's salary. But it wasn't just greed. Michael had grown weary. In conversations caught on wiretaps later, he spoke of being tired of working for scraps while cartels get rich. Disillusionment blended with temptation, and soon he justified every step deeper into the Red Shadows network. That's what made him so dangerous. A man driven only by greed is predictable. A man fueled by both greed and resentment becomes unpredictable. He convinces himself that betrayal is survival, even destiny. Daniel pieced this together too late. By the time he realized Michael's role, the trial had already found him guilty. And betrayal doesn't stop once it begins. While Daniel sat in jail, Michael gave interviews to the press, his tone heavy with sorrow over his partner's downfall. "It's devastating," he told one reporter, his eyes wet. "But the badge means justice even when it hurts." To the public, Michael looked like the grieving friend forced to uphold the law. To Daniel, it was the performance of a lifetime, and the world believed it. Protesters outside the courthouse shouted Daniel's name with venom. Articles portrayed him as the face of hunter brutality. The very man who once carried a grizzly bear cub to safety was now branded as an enemy of conservation. The irony was cruel, and Michael was the one tightening the screws. Sometimes the most dangerous predators in wilderness stories aren't the bears or wolves. They're the humans who learn to mask betrayal as loyalty until the moment it becomes a weapon. Emily sensed it even if she didn't have the words. She asked Daniel once during a prison visit, "Why does Mr. Hayes look so sad on TV if he hurt you?" Her confusion cut deeper than any accusation. Children expect villains to look like villains, but betrayal wears familiar faces. That's why it devastates. And yet hidden in this storm was a thread of hope. Because corruption, no matter how carefully planned, always leaves traces. Every falsified document, every wire transfer, every whispered warning becomes a breadcrumb. The Red Shadows could control evidence inside a courtroom, but they couldn't erase everything outside of it. Daniel held on to that thought like a lifeline. If betrayal had led him here, perhaps truth could still lead him out. The betrayal in the wilderness was not just about Daniel losing a friend. It was about a system unraveling a network feeding cartels while destroying the lives of those who stood in its way. Other officers had already fallen, some framed, some accidentally killed on duty. Daniel would later learn he wasn't the first, only the most visible. And that visibility mattered. Because while betrayal works best in silence, exposure is its enemy. The very press that condemned him would soon become the tool for unraveling the lies. The very cub he once saved would become proof that loyalty can outlive betrayal. For now, though Daniel sat in his cell, haunted by the image of Michael's expressionless eyes as he testified against him. The man he once trusted with his daughter's safety was now the man who ensured she would grow up without a father. That was the wilderness Daniel faced, not of trees and rivers, but of human deception. But wilderness has a way of revealing what's hidden. Just as a hunter can follow faint tracks to an animal, unseen truth leaves its own trail. It was only a matter of time before Daniel, or those still willing to fight, would find it. And the first real clue would come from the shadows themselves. Whispers of a network so vast it reached across departments, states, and borders. The wilderness of betrayal was giving way to something larger: conspiracy. Corruption is never loud at first. It doesn't burst into rooms or announce itself in headlines. It whispers, it hides in paperwork. No one checks in shipments, no one traces in conversations cut short the moment someone honest walks by. Daniel Whitaker's life had been upended by one betrayal. But as the days crawled by in his cell, it became clear that Michael Hayes was not acting alone. What had happened to Daniel was part of something bigger, darker, and far older than he realized. The name surfaced like smoke, the Red Shadows. Among officers, it wasn't a name anyone spoke openly. It was more of a rumor, a curse whispered in parking lots after long shifts. The Red Shadows weren't a gang in the traditional sense. They were a network: law enforcement officers, deputies, border patrol agents, even clerks in evidence rooms. At first, it was small. A few weapons were siphoned off from lockups, sold quietly for cash. But networks grow the way fire spreads in dry grass. Once people see others profiting, once they convince themselves it's just one shipment, the corruption multiplies. By the time Daniel stumbled onto the missing firearms, the Red Shadows had infiltrated departments across 3 states. Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming all carried scars of their reach. Cartels south of the border depended on these shipments, confiscated American rifles clean and untraceable, flowing right back into Mexico, where they fueled violence and profit. In exchange, money funneled back into the pockets of officers who were supposed to stop it. Corruption at this level rarely looks like chaos. It looks like an order. Reports filed on time, chain of custody forms signed by familiar names, radios crackling with the right codes. From the outside, everything seems by the book. That's what makes it so effective. One FBI agent later compared the Red Shadows to a wolf pack in the forest. To hikers, the woods seemed calm, safe. But the wolves hunted in silence, coordinated, leaving little trace until a body appeared. The metaphor fit. Daniel had unknowingly brushed against their trail years earlier. During Operation Timberline, a multi-agency bust aimed at seizing cartel weapons, he had raised questions about discrepancies. Some rifles logged as destroyed reappeared in crime scenes. He filed reports, but nothing came of them. What he didn't know then was that Hayes and others in the Red Shadows buried those reports before they reached Washington. From that moment, Daniel had been marked not because he had proof, but because he had instincts sharp enough to sense something was wrong. There's an example worth pausing on here. In 2011, federal investigators uncovered a real case where confiscated firearms, instead of being destroyed, were funneled to criminal groups. It was called Operation Fast and Furious. The fallout was enormous: hearings in Congress, careers destroyed, lives lost. The Red Shadows mirrored that same pattern, except their cover-up was tighter and their reach was deeper into rural departments where scrutiny was rare. Corruption doesn't need everyone to participate. It only needs enough key people in the right places: an officer to move the weapons, a clerk to alter the records, a prosecutor willing to look the other way. Once those pieces align, honest officers become outnumbered, and the system itself becomes the weapon. For Daniel, learning the scale of the red shadows was both devastating and clarifying. Devastating because it meant his betrayal was not personal, it was structural. Clarifying because it meant the enemy was no longer just one man. It was a network that thrived on silence and fear. But fear has cracks. And into those cracks the FBI eventually crept. The Bureau had been tracking whispers of the red shadows for months, maybe years long before Daniel's arrest. Wiretaps on suspected officers revealed coded language about lumber shipments and night deliveries. Financial trails led to offshore accounts, the kind Michael Hayes had dipped into. Undercover agents blended into departments wearing badges by day and transmitting reports by night. Slowly, a picture formed. The red shadows weren't just selling weapons. They were eliminating threats. Whistleblowers died in accidents. Files went missing. Families were intimidated. Daniel was one of those threats. Framing him for Javier's murder was as much about silencing him as it was about sending a message. This is what happens when you dig too deep. When people imagine crime networks, they often think of outsiders. Gangs, foreign operatives, shadowy figures in dark alleys. But some of the most effective networks wear uniforms, carry badges, and recite oaths of service. That's what makes them so hard to fight. To the public, they look like protectors. To insiders, they are predators. Meanwhile, the press latched onto Daniel's story without knowing the larger truth. They painted him as the hunter-turned-murderer because that narrative sold. What they missed, or perhaps what they hadn't uncovered yet, was how his case tied into a conspiracy stretching far beyond a single courtroom. And civilians paid the price. Communities lost trust. Families wondered whether calling the sheriff meant safety or risk. Some began to suspect that their protectors were the very people fueling the violence. It created a ripple effect of doubt, one that eroded the foundation of public trust in law enforcement. Daniel, sitting in his cell, didn't know all the details yet, but he sensed it. Each time he replayed Michael's warnings, each time he remembered the evidence that didn't add up, he felt the outlines of a bigger shadow. The wilderness had taught him to track what wasn't visible, the broken twig, the faint scent, the silence where there should be noise. Those same instincts told him the betrayal was part of something coordinated. Survival in the wild and survival against corruption both require the same skill-reading signs others ignore. Daniel had spent his life following faint bear tracks across snowfields. Now he needed to follow human tracks through systems designed to cover them up. But unlike in the wilderness, he wasn't alone anymore. Inside the FBI, an undercover agent named Anna Peterson was piecing together threads. She recognized Daniel's case as the key that could expose the red shadows. If his conviction unraveled, the entire network risked unraveling too. The red shadows had power, but power built on silence always fears exposure, and exposure was coming. The mystery for Daniel wasn't whether corruption existed, he knew now it did. The mystery was whether truth would surface in time to save him, because extradition to Mexico still loomed. And once he was out of U.S. custody, the red shadows wouldn't need to frame him anymore. They could let the execution speak for itself. So the stage was set, a man framed for murder, a network spreading like wildfire across departments, and an undercover investigation closing in. The wilderness of betrayal had revealed its predators. The next question was how Daniel would endure the prison walls pressing in around him, walls that held not just confinement, but the weight of psychological collapse. And that brings us to the next chapter, the fight inside his own mind. Prison changes a person long before the sentence is carried out. For Daniel Whitaker, the steel doors and echoing halls didn't just lock his body away. They began to work on his mind. At first, he tried to stay upright, shoulders squared, like he had in the Marines, like he had in the Montana backcountry when storms closed in. But solitude has its own weather, and in solitary confinement, storms come from the inside. The first nights were the hardest. He lay on a thin mattress, staring at cracked paint above him, hearing the clang of distant gates. Sometimes he thought he heard Copper's playful growl or Emily's laughter echoing in the cell, but when he turned his head, there was nothing. The brain, starved of comfort, creates its own illusions. For Daniel, The hallucinations arrived as scraps of memory. Emily's hand pressed against the glass during a visit. Javier's voice warning him about weapons shipments. Michael's cold eyes testifying against him. The fragments looped endlessly, leaving him unsure which sounds were real and which belonged to the ghost's prison conjures. Psychologists often describe solitary confinement as clean torture. There are no bruises, no broken bones, just a slow erosion of thought and identity. Studies show hallucinations begin within days. Prisoners hear voices, see shadows, relive traumas. Daniel was no exception. One night, convinced he heard footsteps in his cell, he stood ready to fight, only to realize the sound was his own heart thudding against the silence. But even in that bleak space, Daniel found patterns of survival. He remembered the rules of tracking grizzly bears. Stay alert, keep moving, don't let fear freeze you. So he built a routine. Push-ups at dawn, sit-ups before bed, reciting Emily's bedtime stories word for word, as though she were listening, whispering Copper's name until it felt like a prayer. Small rituals became his compass points, keeping him from drifting too far into despair. Here's where an example outside Daniel's story matters. In the 1960s, a young man named Robert Stroud, the Birdman of Alcatraz, survived decades of isolation by raising sparrows he found injured in the yard. For him, caring for something fragile was the antidote to losing his own humanity. Daniel didn't have birds, but he had memory. His sparrow was Copper the cub he once saved, and the belief that loyalty wasn't gone even if people betrayed him. Still, the shadows pressed in. During one visit with Emily, she pressed a drawing to the glass. A stick figure man, a little girl, and a bear cub with a reddish coat. Beneath it, she had written in her uneven letters, Copper remembers. That piece of paper became Daniel's talisman. At night, he traced the memory of it in the air, reminding himself that the outside world still existed, that truth still breathed somewhere beyond concrete walls. There's a lesson in how children see the world. Adults layer on doubt, politics, and cynicism. Children hold on to bonds they've seen with their own eyes. For Emily, Copper's loyalty proved her father's innocence more than any courtroom speech. And strangely, she was right, because the cub's existence would later resurface as evidence. The pressure wasn't just internal. Guards whispered about him in passing. Some called him killer, others muttered that he'd been set up. One guard, a younger man named Tyler Jenkins, lingered once at his cell door. "I had a canine partner once," he said, his voice low. "They said he died in training, but I know he was set up." Then he walked away, leaving Daniel with more questions than answers. It was the first sign that not everyone inside believed the official story. And yet every official record said otherwise. The files on Daniel were stacked: high fingerprints, ballistic matches, witness statements. The red shadows had done their work well. To fight them, Daniel needed more than survival. He needed hope. And hope in prison often comes in fragments. One fragment arrived in the form of a smuggled note slipped under his food tray. "The cub is alive. Don't lose faith." Daniel's pulse quickened. Copper had survived. The sanctuary hadn't turned him over to authorities. The note had no signature, no detail, just those words. But for Daniel, it was enough. If Copper were alive, then not all threads had been cut. That mystery that someone was risking their own safety to pass him a lifeline rekindled Daniel's focus. He began to observe more carefully which guards carried phones they checked too often, which inmates whispered names like shadows when they thought no one listened. Prison, like the forest, carried its own signs, and Daniel began to read them. Resilience isn't always about strength in the traditional sense. Sometimes it's about creating meaning where none exists. In wildlife, grizzly bear cubs survive winters by following their mothers, learning from every movement. Daniel survived prison by following memory, tracking small clues, the way he once tracked elk prints across snow. It wasn't dramatic, but it was survival. The FBI understood this psychology well. Later agents would admit that undercover work mirrored solitary confinement. Their own operatives, embedded inside the red shadows, lived double lives, cut off from friends, clinging to coded communications to stay sane. Daniel unknowingly was enduring the same strain. His fractured mind mirrored the fractured system around him, but prison wasn't just breaking him, it was shaping him for what came next. By the time whispers of outside support reached him, Daniel had already endured the worst of his hallucinations. He knew what it meant to question reality and still choose to stand. He had been tested not just in loyalty, but in patience, the same patience that once helped him sit motionless for hours, tracking a wary black bear. If there's a takeaway here, it's that confinement, whether in prison walls or in the invisible walls of betrayal, forces people to confront themselves. Some collapse, some adapt. Daniel adapted. He found ways to anchor himself in loyalty and memory, in the belief that silence did not mean absence. And silence was about to break. Outside those walls, pressure was building, reporters questioning the chain of evidence, activists wondering if the case was too convenient, FBI surveillance tightening around the red shadows. Inside, Daniel felt the shift. He couldn't name it yet, but his instincts, those same instincts honed in Montana forests, told him the tide was turning. Prison had nearly broken him, but it also taught him to listen to what most ignored, faint sounds, half-hidden signals, whispers that carried more truth than shouts. The walls still stood. His mind is still fractured at the edges. But Daniel wasn't lost. He was waiting, ready for the moment when silence cracked open and truth poured through. And that moment came not from lawyers or judges, but from the roar of public voices, outside voices, that turned his case from a forgotten trial into a storm the system could no longer ignore. The first newspaper headline was blunt, "Hunter turned killer." It spread across Montana like wildfire, feeding the anger already simmering. Protesters crowded courthouse steps, shouting Daniel Whitaker's name like a curse. For weeks it felt as though the world had made up its mind. He was guilty and justice meant death. But public opinion is a tide. It moves quickly, and once it shifts, it can drown even the strongest lies. The shift began with a small article buried on page 6 of the Helena Daily Chronicle. A journalist named Lucy Moreno raised a quiet but powerful question if the rifle was logged in evidence for 2 days before the murder. How could Daniel's prints be so fresh, so clear? Forensic experts knew fingerprints fade within hours unless preserved. Her piece didn't make national news, but locals began murmuring. If one piece of evidence could be wrong, how many others could be too? Soon other outlets joined in. Television crews replayed footage of Daniel carrying Copper the grizzly cub years earlier. The image was too striking to ignore. The man accused of killing an activist was the same once celebrated for saving wildlife. That contradiction gnawed at viewers. Was it possible that the story was more complicated than it seemed? Reporters thrive on tension, and Daniel's case became irresistible. On one side, prosecutors insisted the evidence was airtight. On the other hand, neighbors whispering about missing firearms patterns, too neat to be a coincidence. The press dug deeper. Leaked documents suggested chain of custody violations. Anonymous sources hinted at officers covering tracks. What started as one journalist's question became a chorus of doubt. The press is both a mirror and a magnifier. It reflects what people already suspect, but it also amplifies suspicion until it forces action. In Daniel's case, the media did what the courtroom would not. It reopened questions. Public protests changed tone too. The signs once reading "Execute the Killer" shifted into "Investigate the Evidence." Activists who had stood against hunting found themselves standing beside hunters, united by something larger than their old feud, the belief that justice must be fair. It was an unlikely alliance, conservationists and hunting families chanting the same demand outside the courthouse. The role of community pressure has deep roots in American history. Think of the civil rights trials of the 1960s when public outrage forced courts to confront injustice. Or the Vietnam era, when returning soldiers testified about realities the government wanted hidden and the press gave them a platform. Public opinion doesn't just shape narratives, it pushes institutions to act when they'd rather stay silent. For Daniel, still trapped in his cell, the noise outside reached him in fragments. Guards muttered about rallies downtown. Snippets of news slipped through when a sympathetic officer left a radio playing near his block. He heard his name in chants, sometimes cursed, sometimes defended. It was strange, almost unreal. The world that had condemned him was now beginning to argue over him. Emily felt it more directly. At school, classmates who once taunted her began asking cautious questions. "Do you think your dad really did it?" She always answered the same way Copper knows he didn't. Her simple certainty carried weight. Local reporters picked up her line, framing it as the voice of a child demanding fairness. It touched people's hearts more than any legal brief could. And then came the footage. Animal rescue teams released old clips of Copper at the sanctuary, playful, clumsy, pawing at Daniel through the fence. One video showed Copper pacing anxiously the week after Daniel's arrest, as if sensing his absence. The footage went viral. Hashtags like #Copper Remembers trended. Suddenly, the case wasn't just about a man accused of murder. It was about loyalty, about whether bonds between humans and animals could testify to truth. Sometimes it takes something innocent, a child's drawing a cub's behavior, to cut through cynicism. Facts can be twisted, but loyalty, when visible, is harder to deny. The public began asking if Daniel could inspire such loyalty in both child and cub. Could he really be the monster portrayed in court? Meanwhile, debates broke out over the law itself. Could animal-mounted cameras like those used on canine units ever be admissible as evidence? Legal scholars weighed in. Some pointed to precedents where service dog footage had been allowed in trials. Others argued it was unreliable. But the debate itself mattered. It signaled cracks in the narrative that Daniel's case was simple. Civilian fallout grew. Families began questioning whether their local sheriffs could be trusted. Small town council meetings turned heated as residents demanded accountability and evidence handling. Churches prayed openly for truth to prevail, regardless of guilt or innocence. What had begun as a single trial was now a referendum on trust in law enforcement itself. The red shadows watching from the dark felt the pressure. Exposure is poison to networks built on silence. The louder the public became, the harder it was for them to hide. FBI agents monitoring wiretaps noted hurried conversations, officers warning each other to lay low. The network was strong, but fear had crept in. And in the middle of it all, Daniel endured. The fractured mind he'd fought in solitary now sharpened into resolve. Hope was no longer abstract. It was audible in chants outside his window, visible in Emily's resilience, tangible in Copper's survival. Silence protects corruption, but noise can dismantle it. When people raise their voices, whether in print protest or prayer, they change the balance of power. For Daniel, the public's noise became a lifeline. Still, mystery lingered. Journalists uncovered patterns but couldn't trace them to the source. Who exactly was pulling the strings? Why had evidence been manipulated so perfectly? And how far did the red shadows reach extend? These questions brewed beneath every headline, keeping tension alive. The press explosion bought Daniel something priceless: time. Extradition proceedings slowed under scrutiny. Judges hesitated, wary of backlash. Politicians weighed the cost of aligning with a conviction that smelled of corruption. The tide was turning, but tides are unpredictable. They can flood just as quickly as they retreat. As one reporter wrote, Daniel Whitaker's case is no longer just about one man's fate. It's about whether the truth can survive in a system built to bury it. The system was straining, the shadows shifting, and just when it seemed the pressure could not grow louder, the most unlikely witness, the same cub Daniel once saved, stepped into the center of the storm. The courthouse smelled of polished wood and tension. Reporters filled every bench, their pens ready to carve Daniel Whitaker's story into the record of public opinion. For weeks, the press had been peeling back layers of doubt, and now the world waited to see if those whispers could stand as proof. At the center sat Daniel, thinner from confinement, but steady, his wrists free for the first time in months. What no one expected was the sight that followed him through the doors. Copper, the grizzly bear cub he once carried out of the forest, now older, stronger, but still unmistakably the same reddish-coated survivor. He padded in behind handlers from the sanctuary, a camera collar strapped around his neck. The room gasped, some in awe, some in disbelief. A cub in court, it sounded absurd, almost theatrical. But the handlers explained that Copper's collar had been recording the night Javier Cruz died. The footage was fragmentary. Shadows moved through tall grass, voices muffled. Then, for a few seconds, the lens caught a clear image: Michael Hayes standing over Javier's body weapon, drawn, his face tense in the pale light. The video froze there on the screen. The silence in the courtroom thick enough to feel. For weeks, Daniel had endured the title of hunter-turned-killer. In one frame, the story cracked open. Canine units across the United States already use cameras on working dogs. Their footage has been admitted in courts before, sometimes challenged, sometimes upheld. The law isn't simple. Critics argue that an animal cannot be cross-examined. Supporters counter that the footage is like any body cam, only attached to a different witness. Copper wasn't there to testify. But his collar carried images that no officer could falsify, not without leaving digital traces. The prosecution fought hard, calling it unreliable. Yet the judge listened closely to the forensic experts, who confirmed the timestamps matched the night of the murder, and the digital imprint proved it had not been altered. Slowly, the balance shifted. For Daniel, the most powerful moment wasn't the legal arguments. It was Emily, sitting in the front row, clutching her grandmother's hand, whispering tea. Copper remembered. Her faith, once dismissed as childish, now mirrored what the whole courtroom saw with their own eyes. Sometimes truth doesn't arrive in polished speeches or official reports. Sometimes it comes from the loyalty of a child or the memory of a cub whose only language is presence. Truth doesn't always need translation. It only needs witnesses willing to believe it. The footage sparked more than a trial breakthrough. FBI agents, waiting for the right moment, stepped forward with files. They revealed financial trails from Michael Hayes to offshore accounts, matching testimony from undercover officers embedded in the red shadows. They showed records of other framed officers, men and women who had raised questions only to be buried by false charges. Suddenly, Daniel wasn't an outlier. He was part of a pattern. This fresh perspective hit hard. If corruption could frame a respected hunter and father in Montana, how many others had been silenced elsewhere? Communities watching on television began asking themselves whether their own trusted deputies were truly trustworthy. The red shadows were no longer a whisper, they were exposed. The courtroom became a stage for collapse. Hayes, once Daniel's closest ally, now sat pale and rigid as evidence stacked against him. He had played the grieving partner in public, but the video and bank records stripped away the mask. Reporters scribbled furiously, already crafting headlines: "Hero Hunter Vindicated," "Corrupt Officer Exposed." Civilian fallout came fast. Protesters who once shouted for Daniel's death now held signs demanding justice for him. Hunters and conservationists stood together again, uneasy but united, recognizing that the real enemy was not each other, but the rot within their institutions. For the first time in months, Daniel felt the weight on his chest ease. He wasn't just defending himself anymore, he was standing in a larger fight for truth. During the Watergate hearings decades earlier, a single piece of tape recording unraveled a presidency. It wasn't eloquent speeches that turned the tide, it was raw, unfiltered evidence. Copper's collar carried that same weight. Not perfect, not polished, but undeniable. Still, Daniel knew one video wouldn't end the battle. The red shadows weren't just one man. They were a network, layered and resilient. FBI agents explained that raids were already underway in 3 states, dozens of arrests happening even as the hearing continued. Corruption thrives in silence, but once exposed, it collapses quickly, like ice breaking in spring. And yet, mystery remained. Who sat at the top of the red shadows? Who allowed such a system to grow unchecked? Those questions weren't answered in the courtroom. They lingered, a reminder that truth revealed is only the beginning of accountability. Daniel, listening to the judge dismiss his charges, felt relief but not triumph. Emily ran to him afterward, throwing her arms around his waist, copper rumbling in the background as if echoing her joy. For Daniel, that moment wasn't victory. It was reprieve. The real fight still waited outside. There's a perspective worth holding here. People often think justice ends in a courtroom with gavels and verdicts. But justice is larger than that. It's what happens after the rebuilding of trust, the reform of systems, the healing of those wronged. Daniel's freedom mattered, but the collapse of the red shadows mattered even more, because it meant others wouldn't have to endure what he had. The courtroom emptied that day with more questions than answers. But one truth had emerged clearly. Loyalty leaves traces even in the darkest schemes. Copper had carried that loyalty silently until the moment the world was ready to listen. And as Daniel walked out with Emily's hand in one of his and Copper's steady gaze at his side, he knew the final chapter wasn't about exposing corruption alone. It was about what came after, about redemption legacy and the lessons left for those willing to hear them. The collapse of the red shadows had begun. Now came the question of how to rebuild from the ruins. When Daniel Whitaker stepped out of the courthouse that final morning, the air felt different. Not cleaner, not yet, but lighter, as though the weight pressing down on his chest for months had finally cracked. Emily clutched his hand, her grip firm with a child's stubbornness, while Copper, older and stronger, now padded beside them with steady calm. To the cameras, it looked like a reunion. To Daniel, it was survival made visible. Freedom didn't erase the months of confinement or the nightmares that still clawed at him in the dark. But it gave him the one thing he had almost lost: a future. The collapse of the red shadows spread through news cycles for weeks. Officers in 3 states were arrested, bank accounts, frozen careers ended in disgrace. Some confessed openly, admitting they had sold confiscated weapons to cartels in exchange for money they never thought they'd earn on their salaries. Others stayed silent, but the paper trail was enough to bury them. For the public, the shock was deep. Communities that once trusted their local sheriffs now wondered which deputies had been part of the network. Families who lost loved ones to cartel violence suddenly saw connections they hadn't imagined. The fallout was painful, but it was necessary. Corruption, hidden in shadows, can only be healed when it's dragged into the light. Daniel knew his story wasn't just about him. He had become a symbol of something larger, the proof that even those sworn to protect could fall, and that loyalty, whether from a child or a grizzly bear cub, could be the thread that unraveled lies. The Copper Foundation began with nothing more than a kitchen table, a few volunteers, and Daniel's determination. Its mission was simple: to protect wildlife, while also defending those wrongly accused, giving them resources to fight back when systems turned against them. Emily insisted on naming it after the cub, saying, "Copper saved you, Dad. Now you have to save others." Out of the mouths of children often come the clearest truths. Legacies aren't built in victories alone. They are forged in the fire of suffering and how a person chooses to rise when knocked down. Daniel could have hidden, could have disappeared quietly, once acquitted. Instead, he chose to use his survival as a tool for others. There's an example worth remembering here. In the aftermath of the Watergate scandal, one young lawyer named Charles Ruff took the lessons of that chaos and spent the rest of his career teaching about accountability and ethics in government. He could have retreated, but instead he poured his energy into helping others navigate truth in systems designed to obscure it. Daniel's path mirrored that, choosing to rebuild not just his own life, but the trust of a shaken community. Our greatest contributions often come after our hardest trials. The fracture points of our lives, the betrayals, the accusations, the nights when walls press in, can become the very places where resilience is born. Daniel's fractured mind in prison had nearly broken him, but that same fracture taught him how to listen to faint signals, how to cling to loyalty when everything else crumbled. Those skills became the foundation of his legacy. For Emily, the transformation was personal. She grew stronger, not just in health, but in spirit. She spoke at the Copper Foundation's first community event, her small voice steady as she told the crowd, "My dad didn't give up because I didn't give up. And Copper didn't either." Her words carried further than any press release. She reminded everyone listening that loyalty doesn't require power or status, it requires presence. And Copper, he remained the quiet symbol of it all. Visitors to the sanctuary are often asked to see the bear who had once carried truth on his collar. He couldn't speak, but his presence told the story how an animal often seen as dangerous had revealed the humanity in a man falsely accused. Copper became living proof that wildlife rescue animal sanctuaries and the bonds humans forge with wild animals can transform more than ecosystems, they can transform justice itself. Too often society treats animals as separate from human stories. But sometimes they are the bridge between truth and lies, reminding us of values humans forget: loyalty, instinct, trust, untainted by greed. Copper's role wasn't just symbolic. His camera, his survival became evidence that dismantled corruption. That truth should change how we think about the roles animals play in our lives, not as tools, but as partners. Knowledge came, too, from the painful debates sparked by Daniel's trial. Law schools began hosting panels on whether animal-mounted cameras should be standardized in wildlife enforcement. Legislators drafted bills proposing stricter oversight of evidence rooms. Communities held open forums, demanding that every seized weapon be tracked transparently. These were small but meaningful shifts, proof that lessons were being learned, however slowly. And for Daniel, redemption came not in applause, but in quiet evenings. Sitting on his porch with Emily beside him and Copper resting in the sanctuary's distant fields, he reflected on the storm he had survived. He thought about the night's hallucinations nearly broke him, about the betrayal that cut deepest, about the silence in that courtroom when the death sentence was read. All of it remained part of him. But so did the chants of strangers demanding justice, the scribbled note that told him Copper was alive, the loyalty of his daughter who never doubted. What do we take from his story? That justice is fragile but not absent. That betrayal can wound deeply, but loyalty, whether from people or animals, can heal. That even in the darkest systems, faint signals of truth remain waiting for someone to follow them. This isn't just Daniel's lesson, it's ours. Every one of us faces seasons where trust is tested, where systems fail, where silence feels heavier than any sound. The question isn't whether those seasons will come, they will. The question is how we choose to respond. Do we let the fracture define us, or do we let it become the place where resilience begins? As you listen to Daniel's story, maybe you recognize pieces of your own. Maybe you faced betrayal by someone you trusted. Maybe you've been painted as something you're not. Or maybe you've simply felt the silence of being unseen, unheard. If so, let Copper's story remind you loyalty leaves traces and truth finds its way back, often through the most unexpected witnesses. The red shadows may have collapsed in court, but shadows always return in different shapes. The real victory is not in their fall, it's in people like Daniel, Emily, and even Copper who remind us that light is stronger if we choose to keep it alive. So here's where I leave you with an invitation. Think about the companions in your life, the loyal friend, the child who believes in you, maybe even the dog or cat who never leaves your side. Who has been your Copper? Who stood by you when the world said otherwise? Reflect on that bond, because those are the ties that outlast corruption, betrayal, and fear. And if this story stirred something in you, if it made you pause, reflect, or remember your own battles, stay connected with us. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your story in the comments. Because stories of loyalty, resilience, and second chances aren't just Daniel's. They belong to all of us.